So on the next exam, we will cover the respiratory and urinary systems. The first page provides a nice summary, some of the main structures of the respiratory system. So we see nostril. So question 7 indicated by letter B. Then right behind it, we see nasal cavity, question 1, indicated as letter A. Underneath, below the palate, we see oral cavity indicated by letter C. So question 5. Remember that we normally breathe through nose. And we can recruit mouth to bring in additional volume of air in, like we saw in the case of yawning, to compensate for low oxygen levels. Posterior to these structures, we see pharynx indicated by letter J, and in question 10. Remember that this could be further subdivided into nasopharynx, behind the nose, oropharynx, behind the oral cavity, and laryngopharynx, above the larynx. In fact, larynx, which was commonly known as our voice box, is shown as a letter D and noted in question 9. This is where the paths to the lungs and stomach separated, and it is here where we will also see the vocal cords. Then the windpipe, shown as structure I and asked in question 3, running from the larynx to the lungs. This tube had those C-shaped cartilage rings that you remember, which with the esophagus posterior to it. The trachea divides. Let me zoom up. When the trachea divides into two primary bronchi, that sharp tip was known as carina, and the right primary bronchi, also known as the main bronchus, came in a steeper angle than the left one, meaning that foreign objects often end up to the right lung. We see this as letter H, and also in question 2. You might remember that the apex of the heart was this sharp tip. And similarly, in the lungs, the apex is a sharp tip, but in these, it's the most superior part, deep to the clavicle, shown as E on question 8. We also see that the base of the lung, shown as letter F, and in question 6, rests on the diaphragm. That is shown in this diagram as letter G, and again as question 4. Let's move on to the second page. Remember, we wanted as much of the air as possible to get into direct contact with the nasal mucosa. So we have these 3 projections from the lateral wall. They were called honky. They increased the surface area and created turbulence, so mix the air so that as much of that as possible gets in contact with this wall. Remember, the palate separated the nasal and oral cavities. Anterior portion of that was called hard palate because there was bone inside it, and posterior one soft palate that then turned into uvula. We already discussed the pharynx, the space at the back. It could be divided into 3 regions: behind the nasal cavity, nasopharynx; behind the oral cavity, oropharynx; and above the larynx, the laryngopharynx. Remember, we had those empty spaces within the skull around the nasal area. These were paranasal sinuses. Sometimes these can get inflamed, and we had sinusitis. Let's look at the larynx next. And here we have a nice model of it, with the cartilages having been the ones that we mostly studied. The largest of these was thyroid cartilage, because we have thyroid gland right here. And on it, we see this protrusion anteriorly. This was known in layman's language as the Adam's apple, and in proper anatomical language, laryngeal prominence. Then again, as a reminder, the windpipe was our trachea. Remember, inside of it was lined with these hair-like projections that sweat material upwards, cleaning the lungs. We have now seen in few instances when talking about the immune system structures, and now again, we see tonsils. These clusters of lymphatic tissue could also get inflamed, and we got tonsillitis. Then remember that the vocal cords anchor to the arachnoid cartilages, which we could tilt by muscles, thus tensing and relaxing them. Well, these vocal cords were white in color because there was no direct blood vessels in them. These tissues receive oxygen and nutrients through diffusion from nearby vessels. The space between vocal cords, where the vibrating column of air travels past, is known as prima glottis, or in short, glottis. I think we have already talked about these C-shaped cartilage rings of the trachea, and remember they were made of hyaline cartilage. Then returning back to this model of larynx, the flap-like structure that was normally pointing upwards to ensure that airway was kept open, and could also come down when we swallow food and liquids to direct those to esophagus. That was known as epiglottis. Remember, we had two sets of vocal cords, the true vocal cords that contributed to the voice by altering that vibrating column of air, and then the false vocal cords that did not. We also talked about the fact that the lungs were housed in chest inside this sac known as pleura. There was negative pressure in there that pulled the lungs to be as large as possible within the thoracic cavity. We already mentioned that the trachea divided into two branches. These were our primary or main prongs, then moving further to smaller and smaller branches. We saw that there was a great amount of overlap with the immune system. Within the lungs, there were macrophages known as dust cells that were constantly cleaning the lungs in the smallest structures known as alveoli. And alveoli were these sac-like microscopic smallest structures at the end of the respiratory tree on a microscopic scale of the lungs. Also talked about the phases of respiration, and everything started with the pulmonary ventilation. So this was the process of bringing in air from outside of your body to the lungs and smaller structures, these alveoli. The exchange of gases between alveoli and pulmonary capillaries at the level of the lungs was internal respiration or internal gas exchange. We also remember that breathing required effort. This was because we used muscles to expand our chest cavity using diaphragm, our primary respiratory muscle, and external intercostal muscles. As the chest grew bigger, air flowed in. And let's do the third page. We could have punctured this pleura around the lungs, and the loss of this negative pressure there could cause lung to collapse. systems. We talked about various volumes for air movements. In normal respiration, the amount of air moving in and out, known as tidal volume, was about half a liter. We also explored non-respiratory air movements. Sneezing was when we were trying to dislodge and eject a particle from the nasal cavity. Remember, even during the measurements of respiratory volumes, when we have asked the patient to breathe out as much air as possible, some air still remains in the lungs and respiratory tree. This air was known as being within the dead space. The equipment that we could use to measure respiratory volumes was spirometer. And we saw simple ones as a tube with a leveler just moving up and down as air moved through, and also very complex computerized ones. Returning back to the phases of respiration, at the level of lungs, when oxygen moves from alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries and simultaneously carbon dioxide from the blood in pulmonary capillaries into alveoli, that was known as external gas exchange or external respiration. We saw that a gas known as carbon monoxide was cause for a situation where this colorless, flavorless gas built at the bottom of the room, for example, as a result of a fireplace not having been put out properly. As carbon monoxide builds up in blood, it binds to hemoglobin, preventing oxygen from binding. The person gets tired, often goes to bed, and then dies. This applied also to people who committed suicide by turning on a car in a closed garage and breathing in those toxic fumes. When there is insufficient oxygen delivery to the tissues, we knew that as hypoxia. We also remember that the need to get rid of carbon dioxide was an important driving force for breathing. And if we connect that to the body pH, we see that hyperventilation could result us in getting rid of too much CO2. The respiration is controlled at the brain level, at the brainstem, pons, and medulla. And finally, on this page, eupina was normal respiratory rate of 12 to 15 breaths per minute. This is the medical term for normal, quiet, unlabored breathing that occurs at rest. Remember regular rhythm and passive expiration. It is considered as the baseline of the respiratory state. And off we go to the fourth page. Here we are matching terms with descriptions. Question 41 notes the pharynx signified by letter G, which is the passageway shared by both food and air. Question 42 talks about the trachea, symbolized by letter H, which is our windpipe. So the airway that was reinforced by these C-shaped cartilage rings. Question 43, larynx, marked with letter F, was responsible for routing air to the trachea and lungs, and food down esophagus to the stomach. Question 44, epiglottis, with the letter A on this assignment, serves as this flap-like structure that comes down to seal the trachea when food or liquid is swallowed. Question 45, bronchioles, symbolized by K here, are the smallest branches of the respiratory tree conducting air within the lung. Question 46, alveoli, so letter L here, are these small microscopic sacs where the air travels to and then it is exchanged with the content of the pulmonary capillaries. Finally, question 47 reintroduces us to pleura, a serous membrane that surrounds the lungs. Next, we have a few true-false questions. The first statement claims that the ciliated cells of the nasal mucosa would propel dirty mucus to the pharynx, and this is not true. Then the process of breathing is known as pulmonary ventilation, and that is true. Finally, the respiratory membrane is the air-blood barrier where gases are exchanged. This is true. On this next page, we get to see digestive system illustrated by this diagram. Let's study it. First, on question 51, we find the oral cavity, which is indicated by letter A in this drawing. Then for question 56, we see the tongue indicated by letter B. And we noticed how large it really was. We move on question 53, we see salivary glands indicated by letter O. These were our extrinsic salivary glands, parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. On next page, question 61 shows pharynx, which is indicated with letter N. For question 58, oesophagus, the muscular tube carrying food from mouth to stomach, it is indicated by letter C. Next on question 57, we see stomach, and that's the storage pouch for chyme that was indicated by letter N. Next, we see accessory structures that contribute to the contents within the digestive tract. At this area, D is the liver, which is asked in question 55. It produces bile, which travels to the gallbladder, indicated by letter E in question 65. There, bile gets stored and concentrated. And finally, pancreas, indicated by letter L. And we see that being asked in question 64. For the fun of it, let's also label spleen as letter K on question 60. Now we can return to this continuous tube that is the alimentary canal. We see small intestines as letter F on question 54. Those were duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Then we move on to the large intestines that kind of frame the abdominal cavity here. The first part of those is the cecum, from where a small projection protrudes. This is appendix, indicated with letter H and seen in question 63. We can then follow colon with its various parts, ascending colon coming up on the right-hand side, transverse colon crossing from right to left on superior portion, and descending colon coming down on the left side. And finally, sigmoid colon at the end. These are all part of the large intestine shown with letter J and question 52. We finish off with letter I, indicating rectum, as noted in question 59, and anus is letter G, as seen in question 62. We can continue filling in some caps here. Remember, the process of digestion referred to breaking larger molecules into smaller so that they could be absorbed into the body. Our oral cavity and nasal cavity were separated by a structure known as palate. We saw different parts of the stomach. It was within the region known as cardia where the oesophagus joined the stomach. Fundus was the top part where the gases often built up. Majority of the stomach was body, and finally pylorus before we get to the small intestines. We also remember that the stomach could stretch and shrink. This was thanks to the rugate, those ridges within the wall of stomach. There were three parts to the small intestines: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. I offered the mnemonic DJ eel for those. And as you remember, small intestines were really the business end of this all. This was because the contents were neutralized for pH and we had large surface area for absorption. And these villi, microscopic finger-like projections, added to this large surface area. We also talked about the many functions of the liver, with production of bile being the most relevant to us in this chapter. Process of chewing known as mastication. We saw that at the level of the mouth, it was not just this chewing that mechanically broke down the food, but also chemical digestion by salivary amylase enzyme within the saliva. Then the process of eliminating non-digestible material, and while stomach, generally speaking, one was incredibly poor for absorption due to the thick wall and mucus layer lining it, there were two substances that in particular were absorbed here: alcohol and aspirin. On page 6, we continue this activity. Remember, pepsinogens were secreted in the stomach, but needed that acidity of the hydrochloric acid to convert it into its active form known as pepsin. We talked about the reflex triggering pooping. And then think about the nutrition chapter. Energy value in food is commonly measured as kilocalories. Remember, we had these tables listing those for different materials, but also could measure it with a bomb calorimeter. Carbohydrate, known as glucose, was the most used source for making ATP. We also talked about the total metabolic rate. So how many kilocalories we are using to keep the body going. And finally, the polysaccharide glycogen is formed from the combination of thousands of glucose molecules during a process called glycogenesis, so making larger one from the smaller ones. Let's finish off with some true-false statements. It is true in question 84 that the functions of alimentary canal include ingestion, digestion, absorption, and eliminating waste. Also true that, as stated in question 85, the rhythmic wave-like movement of material within a muscular tube was known as peristalsis. Remember, we used squeezing a toothpaste tube as an example, so peristalsis would be working from one end to another. We are also in agreement that question 86 is true. Small intestines start from pyloric sphincter that separates those from the stomach and continues to the large intestines where they join at ileocecal valve. In question 87, we come back to the Peyer's patches that we talked about in our immune system chapter. You can think of them almost as analogous to tonsils, but this time located within the small intestines, so that statement is true as well. Question 88 claims that the ascending column would be found on the left side of the abdominal cavity. That is incorrect, as it is on the right side. And remember that when we're talking about the sides, it's always in relation to the patient's right or left. Question 89 shows us that the enamel found as the outermost layer of the teeth is one of the hardest materials of the body. That is true. In fact, once we get to the tooth bone, it is pretty porous, so it is important that we protect the enamel. Question 90, we remember that it was liver that produced bile, but that was stored in the gallbladder. So that is true. Question 91 claims that sugars would be lipids. This is, of course, false. Lipids are fats. Question 92, anabolism referred to the process where larger molecules were broken down into smaller. So that is true for this statement. Question 93, proteins are broken into amino acids. That's true. Question 94, hypothalamus was where the body temperature was regulated from. True. Remember the important role of hypothalamus in thermoregulation, maintaining homeostasis of body temperature. Finally, question 95. Parasympathetic nervous system controls largely the digestive processes, so that is true too. And that brings us to the end of this review video. Thank you for joining.